Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading and discussing the Bhikku Sujato translation of the Tevijja Sutta in its entirety. This text comes to us from the Digha Nikaya of the Pali Canon, and in it, the Buddha is instructing followers of Brahmanism on how their practice is similar and different from the Buddhist practice, overall with the tone that the Brahmanical path is inferior to the Buddhist one. He discusses that the Brahmanical path only leads to what are called the four Brahma Viharas, or divine abodes, and these are loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. These are great things to cultivate, but they do not represent complete enlightenment by themselves. We hope you enjoy. So have I heard. At one time the Buddha was wandering in the land of the Kosalans, together with a large sangha of 500 mendicants, when he arrived at a village of the Kosalan Brahmins named Manasakata. He stayed in a mango grove on a bank of the river Achiravati to the north of Manasakata. Now, at that time, several very well-known, well-to-do Brahmins were residing in Manasakata. They included the Brahmins Chanki, Taruka, Pokarasati, Janusoni, Todeya, and others. Then, as the students Vaseta and Bharadvaja were going for a walk, they began a discussion regarding what is the path and what is not the path. Vaseta said this: "This is the only straight path, the direct route that delivers one who practices it to the company of divinity, namely, that explained by the Brahmin Pokarasati." Bharadvaja said this: "This is the only straight path, the direct route that delivers one who practices it to the company of divinity, namely, that explained by the Brahmin Taruka." But neither was able to persuade the other. So Vaseta said to Bharadvaja, "Bharadvaja, the ascetic Gautama, a Shakyan, gone forth from a Shakyan family, is staying in a mango grove on a bank of the river Achiravati to the north of Manasakata. He has this good reputation: that Blessed One is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme guide for those fit for training, teacher of gods and humans, awakened, blessed. Come, let's go see him and ask him about this matter. As he answers, so we will remember it." "Yes, worthy sir," replied Bharadvaja. So they went to the Buddha and exchanged greetings with him. When the greetings and polite conversation were over, they sat down to one side, and Vaseta told him of their conversation, adding, "In this matter we have a dispute, a disagreement, a difference of opinion. So, Vaseta, it seems that you say that the straight path is that explained by Pokarasati, while Bharadvaja says that the straight path is that explained by Taruka. But what exactly is your disagreement about?" "About what is the path and what is not the path, worthy Gautama. Even though Brahmins describe different paths, the Advaryu Brahmins, the Tatiriya Brahmins, the Chandogya Brahmins, the Chandrayana Brahmins, and the Bhavricha Brahmins, all of them still lead someone who practices them to the company of divinity. It's like a village or town that has many different roads nearby, yet all of them meet at that village. In the same way, even though Brahmins describe different paths, the Advaryu Brahmins, the Tatiriya Brahmins, the Chandogya Brahmins, the Chandrayana Brahmins, and the Bhavricha Brahmins, all of them still lead someone who practices them to the company of divinity." Gautama asked Vaseta, "Do you say they lead someone, Vaseta?" "I do, worthy Gautama." "Do you say they lead someone, Vaseta?" "I do, worthy Gautama." "Do you say they lead someone, Vaseta?" "I do, worthy Gautama." "Well, of the Brahmins who are proficient in the three Vedas, Vaseta, is there even a single one of them who has seen the divinity with their own eyes?" "No, worthy Gautama." "Well, has even a single one of their tutors seen the divinity with their own eyes?" "No, worthy Gautama." "Well, has even a single one of their tutors seen the divinity with their own eyes?" "No, worthy Gautama." "Well, has anyone back to the 7th generation of tutors seen the divinity with their own eyes?" "No, worthy Gautama." "Well, What of the ancient seers of the Brahmins proficient in the three Vedas, namely Attaka, Vamaka, Vamadeva, Vesamita, Yamadagi, Angirasa, Bharadvaja, Vaseta, Kashapa, and Bhagu? They were the authors and propagators of the hymns. Their hymnal was sung and propagated and compiled in ancient times. In these days, Brahmins continue to sing and chant it, chanting what was chanted and teaching what was taught. Did they say, "We know and see where the divinity is," or "which way it lies"? No, worthy Gautama. So it seems that none of those Brahmins have seen the divinity with their own eyes, and not even the ancient seers claimed to know where it is. Yet the Brahmins proficient in the three Vedas say, "We teach the path to the company of that which we neither know nor see. This is the only straight path, the direct route that delivers one who practices it to the company of divinity." What do you think, Vaseta? This being so, doesn't their statement turn out to have no demonstrable basis? Clearly that is the case, worthy Gautama. Good, Vaseta, for it is impossible that they should teach the path to that which they neither know nor see. Suppose there was a queue of blind men, each holding the one in front. The first one does not see, the middle one does not see, and the last one does not see. In the same way, it seems to me that the Brahmin's statement turns out to be comparable to a queue of blind men. The first one does not see, the middle one does not see, and the last one does not see. Their statement turns out to be a joke, mere words, vacuous and hollow. What do you think, Vaseta? Do the Brahmins proficient in the three Vedas see the sun and moon just as other folk do? And do they supplicate and entreat them, following their course from where they rise to where they set, with joined palms held in worship? Yes, worthy Gautama. What do you think, Vaseta? Though this is so, are the Brahmins proficient in the three Vedas able to teach the path to the company of the sun and moon, saying, "This is the only straight path, the direct route that delivers one who practices it to the company of the sun and moon"? No, worthy Gautama. So it seems that even though the Brahmins proficient in the three Vedas see the sun and moon, they are not able to teach the path to the company of the sun and moon. But it seems that even though they have not seen the divinity with their own eyes, they still claim to teach the path to the company of that which they neither know nor see. What do you think, Vaseta? This being so, doesn't their statement turn out to have no demonstrable basis? Clearly that's the case, worthy Gautama. Good, Vaseta, for it is impossible that they should teach the path to that which they neither know nor see. Suppose a man were to say, "Whoever the finest lady in the land is, it is her that I want, her that I desire." They'd say to him, "Worthy man, that finest lady in the land who you desire, do you know whether she's an aristocrat, a Brahmin, a peasant, or a menial?" Asked this, he'd say, "No." They'd say to him, "Mister, that finest lady in the land who you desire, do you know her name or clan, whether she's tall or short or medium, whether her skin is black, brown, or dingy, what village, town, or city she comes from?" Asked this, he'd say, "No." They'd say to him, "Worthy man, do you desire someone who you've never even known or seen?" Asked this, he'd say, "Yes." What do you think, Vaseta? This being so, doesn't that man's statement turn out to have no demonstrable basis? Clearly that's the case, worthy Gautama. In the same way, doesn't the statement of those Brahmins turn out to have no demonstrable basis? Clearly that's the case, worthy Gautama. Good, Vaseta, for it is impossible that they should teach the path to that which they neither know nor see. Suppose a man was to build a ladder at the crossroads for climbing up to a stilt-long house. They'd say to him, "Worthy man, that stilt-long house that you're building a ladder for, do you know whether it's to the north, south, east, or west? Or whether it's tall, or short, or medium?" Asked this, he'd say, "No." They'd say to him, "Worthy man, are you building a ladder for a longhouse that you've never even known or seen?" Asked this, he'd say, "Yes." What do you think, Vaseta? This being so, doesn't that man's statement turn out to have no demonstrable basis? Clearly that's the case, worthy Gautama. In the same way, doesn't the statement of those Brahmins turn out to have no demonstrable basis? Clearly that's the case, worthy Gautama. Good, Vaseta, for it is impossible that they should teach the path to that which they neither know nor see. Suppose the river Achiravati was full to the brim so a crow could drink from it. Then along comes a person who wants to cross the river to the far shore. Standing on the near shore, they'd call out to the far shore, "Come here, far shore, come here, far shore." What do you think, Vaseta? Would the far shore of the Achiravati river come over to the near shore because of that man's call, request, desire, or expectation? No, worthy Gautama. In the same way, Vaseta, the Brahmins proficient in the 3 Vedas proceed having given up those things that make one a true Brahmin, and having undertaken those things that make one not a true Brahmin. Yet they say, we call upon Indra, we call upon Soma, we call upon Varuna, we call upon Isana, we call upon the progenitor, we call upon the divinity, we call upon Mahidi, we call upon Yama. So long as they proceed in this way, it's impossible that they will, when the body breaks up after death, be reborn in the company of divinity. Suppose the river Achiravati was full to the brim, so a crow could drink from it. Then along comes a person who wants to cross over to the far shore. But while still on the near shore, their arms are tied tightly behind their back with a strong chain. What do you think, Vaseta? Could that person cross over to the far shore? No, worthy Gautama. In the same way, the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation are called chains and fetters in the training of the noble one. What 5? Sights known by the eye, which are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. Sounds known by the ear, which are the same. Smells known by the nose, which are the same. Tastes known by the tongue, which are the same. Touches known by the body, which are the same. These are the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation that are called chains and fetters in the training of the noble one. The Brahmins proficient in the 3 Vedas enjoy these 5 kinds of sensual stimulation, tied, infatuated, attached, blind to the drawbacks, and not understanding the escape. So long as they enjoy them, it's impossible that they will, when the body breaks up after death, be reborn in the company of divinity. Suppose the river Achiravati was full to the brim so a crow could drink from it. Then along comes a person who wants to cross the river to the far shore, but they'd lie down wrapped in cloth from head to foot. What do you think, Vaseta? Could that person cross over to the far shore? No, worthy Gautama. In the same way, the 5 hindrances are called obstacles and hindrances and encasings and shrouds in the training of the noble one. What 5? The hindrances of sensual desire, ill will, dullness and drowsiness, restlessness and remorse, and doubt. These 5 hindrances are called obstacles and hindrances and encasings and shrouds in the training of the noble one. The Brahmins proficient in the 3 Vedas are obstructed, hindered, encased, and shrouded by these 5 hindrances. So long as they are so obstructed, it's impossible that they will, when the body breaks up after death, be reborn in the company of divinity. What do you think, Vaseta? Have you heard that the Brahmins who are elderly and senior, the tutors of tutors, say whether the divinity is encumbered with possessions or not? That it is not, worthy Gautama. Is its heart full of enmity or not? It is not. Is its heart full of ill will or not? It is not. Is its heart corrupted or not? It is not. Does it wield power or not? It does. What do you think, Vaseta? Are the Brahmins proficient in the 3 Vedas encumbered with possessions or not? They are. Are their hearts full of enmity or not? They are. Are their hearts full of ill will or not? They are. Are their hearts corrupted or not? They are. Do they wield power or not? They do not. So it seems that the Brahmins proficient in the 3 Vedas are encumbered with possessions, but the divinity is not. But would Brahmins who are encumbered with possessions join together and converge with the divinity, who isn't encumbered with possessions? No, worthy Gautama. Good, Vaseta. It is impossible that the Brahmins who are encumbered with possessions will, when the body breaks up after death, be reborn in the company of divinity, who isn't encumbered with possessions. And it seems that the Brahmins have enmity, ill will, corruption, and do not wield power, while the divinity has no enmity, ill will, or corruption, and who does wield power. But would Brahmins, who are opposite to the divinity in all things, join together and converge with him? No, worthy Gautama. Good Vaseta. It is impossible that Brahmins who are opposite to the divinity in all these things will, when the body breaks up after death, be reborn in the company of divinity. Now, in this regard, Vaseta, those Brahmins proficient in the 3 Vedas, having dived in, sink down. Having sunk down, they undergo drowning, imagining they are crossing to the dry shore. That's why the 3 Vedas of the Brahmins are called a salted land, and a barren land, and a disaster. When he said this, Vaseta said to the Buddha, I have heard, worthy Gautama, that you know the path to company with divinity. What do you think, Vaseta? Is the village of Manasakata nearby? Yes, it is. What do you think, Vaseta? Suppose a person was born and raised in Manasakata, and as soon as they left the town, some people asked them for the road to Manasakata. Would they be slow or hesitant to answer? No, worthy Gautama. Why is that? Because they were born and raised in Manasakata. They're well acquainted with all the roads to the village. Still, it's possible they might be slow or hesitant to answer. But the realized one is never slow or hesitant when questioned about the realm of divinity or the practice that leads to the realm of divinity. I understand the divinity, the realm of divinity, and the practice that leads to the realm of divinity, practicing in accordance with which one is reborn in the realm of divinity. When he said this, Vaseta said to the Buddha, I have heard, worthy Gautama, that you teach the path to company with divinity. Please teach us that path, and elevate this generation of Brahmins. Well then, Vaseta, listen and apply your mind as well. I will speak. Yes, worthy sir, replied Vaseta. The Buddha said this. It's when a realized one arises in the world, perfected, a fully awakened Buddha. That's how a mendicant is accomplished in ethics. Seeing that the hindrances have been given up in them, joy springs up. Being joyful, rapture springs up. When the mind is full of rapture, the body becomes tranquil. When the body is tranquil, they feel bliss. And when blissful, the mind becomes immersed. They meditate, spreading a heart full of love to one direction, and to the second, and to the third, and to the fourth. In the same way above, below, across, everywhere, all around, they spread a heart full of love to the whole world, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of enmity and ill will. Suppose there was a powerful horn blower. They'd easily make themselves heard in the 4 quarters. In the same way, when the heart's release by love has been developed like this, any limited deeds they've done don't remain or persist there. The mind in jhana is so powerful that it effectively overrides any limited karma, including ordinary good or bad deeds. Unless they have committed serious crimes with a fixed karmic result, such as matricide, etc., the meditator will be reborn in a Brahma realm. This is a path to company with divinity. Furthermore, a mendicant meditates, spreading a heart full of compassion, and it is the same. They meditate, spreading the heart full of rejoicing, and it is the same. They meditate, spreading a heart full of equanimity to one direction, and to the second, and to the third, and to the fourth, and it is the same. Suppose there was a powerful horn blower. They'd easily make themselves heard in the 4 quarters. In the same way, when the heart's release by equanimity has been developed and cultivated like this, any limited deeds they've done don't remain or persist there. This too is a path to divinity. What do you think, Vaseta? When a mendicant meditates like this, are they encumbered with possessions or not? They are not. Is their heart full of enmity or not? It is not. Is their heart full of ill will or not? It is not. Is their heart corrupted or not? It is not. Do they wield power or not? They do. So, it seems that mendicant is not encumbered with possessions, and neither is the divinity. Would a mendicant who is not encumbered with possessions join together and converge with the divinity who isn't encumbered with possessions? Yes, worthy Gotama. Good, Vaseta. It's quite possible that a mendicant who is not encumbered with possessions will, when the body breaks up after death, be reborn in the company of divinity, who isn't encumbered with possessions. And it seems that that mendicant has no enmity, ill will, corruption, and does wield power, while the divinity is the same in all these things. Would a mendicant who is the same as the divinity in all things join together and converge with him? Yes, worthy Gotama. Good, Vaseta. It's quite possible that that mendicant will, when the body breaks up, after death, be reborn in the company of divinity. When he had spoken, Vaseta and Bharadvaja said to him, Excellent, worthy Gotama, excellent. As if he were writing the overturned, or revealing the hidden, or pointing out the path to the lost, or lighting a lamp in the dark so people with clear eyes can see what's there. Worthy Gotama has made the teaching clear in many ways. We go for refuge to the worthy Gotama, to the teaching, and to the mendicant Sangha. From this day forth, may the worthy Gotama remember us as lay followers who have gone for refuge for life. Thus ends the Tevijja Sutta. So that was the Tevijja Sutta. Docs, what did you think?
That was an interesting one. So there's a lot going on here that we can kind of talk about both in specific and that's going on throughout the reading. So I'm going to start with one of the latter, something going on throughout the reading, which is this is a Buddhist document talking about a non-Buddhist religion that they are contemporary with. So the Brahmins are, just by the nature of what's happening here, are not going to come out of this looking great. And we've seen how hard Buddhist documents tear into each other. And it's interesting that it seems no less, I would say, firm about Buddhism's superiority here, but it's a lot less insulting about it. There are definitely things that I suspect the Brahmins would object to being said about them in here, but it's not as insulting as when Mahayana is talking about Theravada.
Yeah, well, and I don't want to be too cynical about it, but the truth of the matter is that in this text, the Buddha is talking to people that are potential converts. And whenever the Mahayana texts are talking to Theravada Buddhists, they don't expect conversion, and they don't expect that they're going to change their ways. And so the language is obviously still talking about the superiority of Buddhism in this text, but it seems to be much more gentle and much more polite, at least, to the faces of these Brahmins that the Buddha is talking to, because he's trying to bring them in to the fold rather than accost them for doing something that, the other authors of the Mahayana sutras might believe to be wrong or inadequate or insufficient.
Yeah, like I said, the tone is visibly different when this conversation is happening. So I just found that really interesting, the way this religion can be less kind to people that are closer to it than people who are outside of it. It's just fascinating to see. So let's move on and get into some details. So very early on, we have a discussion of different types of Brahmins. This is regarding a outside religion, so I don't expect to get a ton of detail here, but what do we know about these different types of Brahmins? What kind of differences are there between these groups?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to start with answering that, I'm just going to go back over the broad trajectory of Brahmanism that we have talked about on the show before, and then I will give sort of as close as I can give to a one-to-one description, one descriptor to one title of a sect based on the sects that we get mentioned in this sutta. So for the overall general trajectory of Brahmanism at the time of the Buddha and his career preaching and giving the sermons, basically the idea in the religion at that point, in Brahmanism, which you could also call Hinduism, which you could also call Vedic philosophy, lots of different names for basically a rather varied and diverse group of thinkers and ritual practitioners who are all aligned according to a certain cosmology and a certain set of ritual practices. The cosmology of it all is that they believe, just like in Buddhism, that we are in the cycle of samsara, and that we undergo reincarnation due to karma, and that rebirth in various levels is possible based on one's karma. And the way to achieve liberation from samsara, not nirvana, mind you, but liberation which is called moksha in Sanskrit, is through attaining oneness with Brahman, or the god Brahma, this ultimate reality of which we all contain a piece in our souls, right? And we've talked often about how the main difference between Brahmanism and Buddhism as relates to the Four Noble Truths, for example, is that the Brahmins believe that there is a soul, and that that soul is like a piece of the Almighty or the ultimate or whatever you would like to call it. And Buddhism says, of course, there is no soul, there is no self. And all of these different sects or schools of Brahmanism that we get descriptors of in this sutta essentially have different ways of interpreting and understanding that cosmology in more specific ways as it pertains to practice. So there are 6 major schools of Vedic philosophy or of Brahmanism, and these are all different groups that interpret the Vedas, the holy texts of Brahmanism, of Vedic philosophy, in a different way. So the Nyaya Brahmins are basically the rationalists. They believe that interpreting the Vedas should be done in a very concrete and a very rational seeming kind of way. Rationalism is a Western phenomenon, and it's a Western term to refer to Western things, but it describes a process of exegesis or interpretation of a text that basically involves what is on the page and nothing else, and what the structure of the argument in the text is and nothing else. And so the Nyaya school is basically summed up as being the rationalists.
Seems like you could also refer to them as like literalists, like they're talking very specifically about what is literally on the literature.
Exactly, yes. And they're referring to basically that which they believe could be possible based on what the text says and what couldn't be possible. What could be useful, what couldn't be useful, entirely based on what the Vedas say.
Makes sense.
There's 3 Vedas at this time. The 4th Veda has not been settled on, and so that might be something that tosses up a few readers who are in the know. The Tevijja Sutta only mentions 3, but there are now 4 Vedas, because later in history the 4th Veda was compiled and settled upon. The next school is the Vaisheshika Brahmins, and we've actually encountered them before in the Buddhist texts. These are actually the atomists that believe that the world is made up of these tiny, infinitesimally small, unobservable, unchanging bits called atoms. And the atoms themselves don't undergo any change, but they rearrange in particular ways to make the world present in the varied and diverse way that it does. So these are people who interpret the substance of the cosmology that's described in the Vedas as being composed of atoms. And all of their practice and interpretation and belief system flows forth from that belief. And their whole entire viewpoint on Vedic philosophy is colored by that belief. In specific, I couldn't tell you much more than that because I just am not familiar with the Brahmanical traditions as I am with Buddhism. But essentially, their core difference from these other schools is going to be that they believe in the existence of these tiny unchanging components or building blocks of the world. The next school is the Samkhya school, and these are the mind-matter dualists. So we have in Western philosophy René Descartes and his I think therefore I am claim, and this establishes a Western philosophical precedent for believing in something called mind-matter dualism or mind-body dualism, where we believe that the nature of mind is a ghost and a shell, we are a mind, but we have and we occupy a body. And these two things are separate, and they interact with each other and they mix and meld with each other in order to make life happen, but they are fundamentally two different things. And the Samkhyas believe that it is this mind that is the vehicle by which you're able to achieve moksha. And it is this body which does the work, so to speak. So you change your mind, but you work your body. And through those ascetic practices, that's how you achieve moksha, or liberation from samsara. The next school is the yoga school, but that's not relevant here because it didn't exist until at least 1000 CE, at least until the 11th century. So we don't really lump them in for the purposes of this text. But that's the school, of course, from which we derive modern yoga practice. The next school is the Mimamsa school, and this school is known for having contributed a lot to the Hindu idea of dharma, which we've talked about before as meaning not the teaching or the law or the universal truth, but as meaning the duty that one has in their role in society and their universal or cosmic duty that is fulfilled by them filling out that role accordingly. Dharma is the source from which the caste system that we've talked about before flows, and it is the source from which we get these different definitions between Hindus and Brahmins and Buddhism with regard to that term dharma. The next school is the Vedanta school. These are the predecessors to Vaishnavites, or worshippers of Vishnu. This is a much more ritualistically oriented kind of school and much less, I would say, philosophical and like exegetical oriented school. They are focused mainly on rituals and interpretations of Vishnu that are relevant to everyday practice, but are not necessarily going to result in a huge amount of textual discourse and religious and doctrinal debate that we would be used to seeing in Buddhism. So these are the groups that the Buddha is addressing whenever he's addressing all of these Brahmanical thinkers and these experts in the three Vedas. These schools are not necessarily as like specific and drawn out and self-identifying as we might think they would be from having names for them now, but essentially scholars have read back these groups onto historical traditions that the Buddha has been engaging with and addressing in the Pali Canon in particular. I find it very interesting that after the Pali Canon sutras, the Buddha doesn't ever actually really talk that much to Brahmins anymore. It only really happens in the Pali Canon here that he talks to these people. And then in the Mahayana sutras, he's really preaching to an audience of bodhisattvas or of people who want to become bodhisattvas. And it kind of becomes clear because sometimes in the Mahayana sutras, people will get up and leave while he's talking because they're not interested. So there's a famous scene in the Lotus Sutra where people get up and leave, and there's plenty of other scenes where people who do not have any interest in the bodhisattva path, they get up and leave, or they're just simply not present in the audience at all, and they're not included as part of like who the Buddha cares about or is talking to in that moment. So I find that fascinating that a lot of this Hinduism/Brahmanism versus Buddhism debate only happens in these suttas here.
It is interesting, and I think it kind of indicates a reality of the different thinkers who wrote later sutras, which was many of them would have been no longer in India, right? These are thinkers who were primarily from China and then the various nations that received Buddhism after it had moved away from India. So in real life, the people writing these texts would not have had Brahmins to refer to in their lives in a way that would be at all useful for what they're writing.
There is that aspect to it, but another aspect is that, there were Mahayana sutras being authored and compiled in India around I would say the 1st, 2nd century before the Common Era, before Buddhism went to China yet. But it was just interesting, the Buddha's and Buddhism's timing in history. It kind of came up at a time where Vedic philosophy was falling out of favor, globally speaking, in India. So it might have been a case where it was both the fact that Buddhism became the new popular thing and became more of a larger and more popular growing movement at the same time as Vedic philosophy, Brahmanical philosophy was sort of on the decline. And there's a bunch of historical context to that we don't need to get into here, but it's a combination of these factors that kind of results in the disappearance of Brahmins from the texts.
So there's multiple factors that could explain it, basically. That
Right.
makes sense. So next thing I wanted to talk about, so a recurring theme through part of this is the Buddha asking, is there even a single one who has seen the capital D divinity with their own eyes? So in the context of the text, that is a valid thing to point out to the Brahmins, like, hey, have any of your masters actually experienced the divinity that you're talking about? And within the context of the writing, the Buddha has. Like, he has acquired his philosophy's ultimate form, basically. He has done the ascending that the Brahmin class is pointing to, but is seemingly, at least within the context of this, not actually reached in a way that they can spread it in the same way as what the Buddha is up to. But if you take the context out of the text and think about, you and I as people reading this text in the year 2025, that criticism applies to Buddhism as well at this point. The Buddha is long dead, and we don't have somebody who has achieved the same kind of enlightenment that the Buddha in these texts. It comes with supernatural powers. So we're back to being the blind, being led by the blind based on the text that we're reading. So it's like, it's interesting that you change the context and a criticism that was a valid jab to the other side becomes something that hits us too now.
Yeah, it's a very interesting historical reversal. To sum it up, the Buddha is saying, you guys are getting stuck and spinning your wheels with blind faith, not us. And then the Buddha died, and then suddenly faith became a huge deal in Buddhism. It became a very critical part of practicing and following and being a part of it. So it's a fascinating turn of the tables, so to speak. That's from us outside looking in, that
Right.
This critique comes forth. Within Buddhism, of course, even in the modern times, they say that there is no blind faith to be found, even though it kind of looks like there is. They say there is no blind faith going on, because the idea here is that, in more specific terms, the Buddha is saying to the Brahmins, have any of your people ever actually achieved moksha? And this is a very specific and a very good question, because it points to the fact that according to this Brahmanical cosmology, you can't achieve moksha while you're alive. You can achieve enlightenment while you're alive in Buddhism, but you can't achieve moksha while you're alive in Hinduism. And so this is very much a situation of like, what you're talking about is well beyond the veil. And you can make claims about beyond the veil, and you can claim to have special, sacred, supernatural, preternatural, supranatural knowledge, whatever you want to call it, about what's beyond the veil. But the truth is, you just have to believe. Whereas here I am, I've achieved enlightenment, and all these people saw it, and they're following me because they see it, right? So in Buddhism, even after he dies, the idea that enlightenment happens while you're alive, and that awakening and that the Dharma is visible to the naked eye, the living naked eye, so to speak, that idea pervades and continues. So it kind of works on both levels. Like the critique is now applying to both parties from the outside, but from the inside, they would still say that it doesn't really work that way.
Makes sense. And context is everything. The context of the story is very different than the context of people reading the story.
Exactly right.
It's also interesting to me that the Buddha is actually capitalizing on a note of possibly even humility within the Brahmin class, because if they're talking about a thing that they admit they have not achieved themselves, there is a level of, hey, I am merely human. There's a level of humility in that understanding of how moksha works that the Buddha is really capitalizing on a way that almost seems like a cheap shot.
Yeah, well, another aspect of it is that the Buddha is, as much as we would hesitate to think so, knowing about our Western religious ecosystem that we're used to, like between Christianity, Islam, Judaism, what have you, the Buddha is still thought of as a highly respected teacher and master in Indian religious ecosystem, right? Like Buddhism doesn't exist yet. And so there are no insiders or outsiders in as much as there's just the 10 disciples and their tag-alongs and the Buddha himself. And people can come from anywhere and from any other teacher and from any other thing that we now in the scholarship 2,000 years later call a tradition. And they can ask him questions like this. And what it really is seen as in the moment is much more of a philosophical debate. And this is me putting on my Nyaya hat, or my Nyaya rationalist, my literalist sort of hat, is me saying, like, this is almost a situation like two Greek philosophers just standing out in the, in the square, asking each other these kinds of questions and debating the answers, more so than it's like my religion is right and yours is wrong. And I find that interesting about this text and about a lot of the texts that have, Brahmanical people encountering in them. I think that it could be seen as a cheap shot, but it also, at the same time, is, I think, an argumentative tool, so to speak. He's kind of centering the focus on basically one of the fundamental differences that is one of his, I don't want to call it selling points, but is one of his distinguishing characteristics as a thinker, is that he has this idea that something can happen while you're alive and they don't. And they're not going to misrepresent their viewpoints because they still cling to them and they view them. So I think that it may be humility to admit that they haven't seen the divinity with their own eyes, but it also may just be like, yeah, we haven't. That's kind of the point, is that faith is a factor here that we have to cultivate and work with. And the Buddha is simply saying, faith is not important for me over here until he dies, and then it is.
Right.
Right. These changes happen. But it's interesting to see these kinds of debates and how they play out in and out of context.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to examine and interpret what's going on here, and they're also not necessarily mutually exclusive. It can be a matter of the Buddha is taking a shot at a spot where humility is present, but it can also be a valid criticism still. It could be that this is a cheap shot, but it's a cheap shot at a target that exists.
Exactly right, yeah. And that's why it comes up in the beginning, by the way, is because he starts with the most simple and fundamental parts, and then he works his way into these more complicated, more, I guess you could say, abstract concepts that distinguish Brahmanism and Buddhism.
Makes sense. So let's move forward a little bit. I'm going to talk about the simile of the river. So the text talks about calling out to the far shore and expecting it to come to us from the Brahmanical side. So we've seen the far shore, quote unquote, used to reference enlightenment and past readings. And so seeing it here in a way that references it as, like, the people in the know can tell he's talking about enlightenment, but folks outside the know still have the physical image of calling to the shore and asking it to come to me. Like, that is still, even without the far shore as enlightenment idea, that is still a ridiculous thing to expect to happen. So it's interesting to see the double meaning here.
It is, yeah. And that's a very skilled usage of the metaphor on the Buddha's part. The far shore is definitely enlightenment here, and pretty much anywhere else you see it in the sutras, it's going to be a metaphor for enlightenment. And I actually sometimes I get hung up on this part, on this criticism. The Brahmins are, in my view, calling out to the far shore and telling it to come here, come to them. They're not actually getting on the boat and going to it. That criticism is leveled against the Brahmins, but I think that erases and ignores a lot of the ritual efforts that Brahmanism entails and a lot of the societal sort of structures and efforts that Hinduism and Brahmanism function in and on. Like, I'm not defending Brahmanism and the caste system in that way, but I am saying that you have to admit that they're working hard and they're doing something with a purpose in mind. And the Buddha is essentially saying, you guys are being lazy. You guys are trying to make the world bend to your will, and it's not going to. And I don't think that that's a fair account of the rituals and the doctrine and the philosophy that goes into those rituals.
Yeah, I could see someone from the Brahmanical side saying, we're not calling out to the far shore, we're swimming through the river trying to get there.
Yeah. And the Buddha is saying, the only way across to the far shore is my boat.
Right. Yeah, while we're on the subject, let's talk a bit about how Brahmanism in general is referred to in here. So I did start this discussion talking about how it was less insulting than what you see with the interdenominational sniping that we've talked about in previous episodes, but there's still several quite demeaning things or even straw-manning accusations against the Brahmins in here. We get the Buddha dunking on Brahmanism, calling them mere words, vacuous and hollow. He talks about Brahmins themselves as being encumbered with possessions, hearts full of enmity, etc. And again, this is probably straw-manning because enmity is a hell of an accusation to levy at a group of people who are attempting to be religious figures and attempting to lead other people to a better state of being. So it's not as insulting as what we see between denominations in Buddhism, but it's still a lot of demeaning and I would say unfair accusations, because especially heart full of enmity, that's something that I think Brahmins would object to, and probably, I don't know much about how they work, but I suspect that is an inaccurate accusation. So, yeah, it's not as bad, but still pretty bad.
Yeah. So let's give some context here from the text itself. So the Buddha is talking about these masters of the Vedas, and he's asking his pair of guys, Vaseta and Bharadvaja, is the master of the Vedas, does he have a heart full of enmity or not? Does he have a heart full of ill will or not? Is his heart corrupted or not? Does he wield power or not? And the point of all of this, the point of asking all these questions, is to distinguish them in concrete terms from the divinity, from the universal reality that they themselves are trying to preach about and trying to lead people to and try to essentially function in. So the interesting thing is that Vaseta and Bharadvaja, they say the master of the Vedas, they are full of enmity. They are full of ill will. They are corrupted. They do wield power. And then, of course, the divinity doesn't, and that's why they're different. I don't think that heart full of enmity is very true historically, and I'm interested to see why Vaseta and Bharadvaja answer that way. Maybe they are plants. Maybe they're fictional and they are sort of characters invented by Buddhists as straw men for the Buddha to debate against in the sutras. They're literarily invented. Or in another interpretation, maybe they had already converted by this point, and this was sort of a performance where they put forth an inadequate or insufficient defense against the Buddha's arguments on purpose to misrepresent Brahmanism and to further bolster the Buddha's arguments for the purposes of this sermon or whatever. But ultimately, I don't think it's fair to say that they were full of enmity, because here's two Brahmanical guys who show up trying to understand what Buddhism's all about. That doesn't really read enmity to me, or ill will, or corruption, or power wielding. I think that the questions about corruption and power wielding, those are historically relevant, in my view, because we have this whole Dharma, Ashrama, Varna, or this like whole caste system thing that we're working in. And so does he wield power? Obviously, the Brahmins with an I rather than an A, they obviously wield power. They're the wealthiest and the most important and the most privileged and the highest level of society, the highest caste of society, the most well looked upon group of people. And so they're very powerful, very influential, very much in charge of the direction of the country, of the kingdom, of the state, of society and stuff. They are the ones that dictate how the Vedas ought to be interpreted and operationalized into daily life. So very powerful. And power does corrupt. So I think that it's fair to say that some Brahmins might have been corrupt. They might have had the interests of state at heart. They might have had the interests of wealth at heart. They might have had the interests of continuing an exploitative caste system for their own profits at heart. That's potentially true and fair to say. But enmity, ill will on the parts, especially of these two guys who are just trying to come in and figure out and learn about Buddhism, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense here at all. I think that there is some straw manning going on here that is trying to reach out to the level of all Brahmanical thinking that just doesn't really map in a way that gets the point across. It's just very, as we say, insulting and very slinging mud, so to speak.
Yeah, and we can also, again, coming out from the context of the story and into the context of us reading it now, we can see past instances where we've talked about on the show and just in history of Buddhists wielding power and becoming corrupt as a part of it. The criticisms that land on the Brahmanical folks are criticisms that land on humans, period.
Right.
So it is not at all specific to the Brahmins. So again, these are valid accusations that are being applied too narrowly in that case. So again, it's a matter of misrepresenting Buddhism as being more pure and Brahmanism as having more ill will involved. So this is a text that is supposed to be describing the superiority of Buddhism, so we're not going to get a fair assessment of what's happening here. And like we said, there's ways to poke holes in this, even within its own context, because of how, like, a Brahmin is within their right to say, hey, we're not all filled with enmity.
Yeah, exactly.
Another detail I want to poke at is we have in this text the formulas for jhanic meditation, and I recognize this from previous readings and things we've studied on the show already, but the version of the formulas here is really truncated and it doesn't name itself directly as jhanic. So that's really interesting, and it gives me an impression that this text is meant for readers who are already pretty familiar with Buddhist ideas. Aspects of this would just go over the heads of beginners who don't know what to look for as far as the different types of meditation. So this is kind of like a intermediate, at least, level sutta.
Yeah, well, you know what's happening with this formula of meditation, which is really interesting, is that it's actually an early presentation, like it's an early, I guess you could say, iteration or an early version of what will later in history from the time of this text be settled upon as a tradition of jhanic meditation. And I find it interesting because it's clearly intelligible to the listeners, and it also has a slightly different structure than what jhana eventually will have. And I think that what's fascinating about that is it shows that the meditation tradition that is now jhanic meditation, jhana or Zen or Chan meditation, it has roots in Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions, and it is something that we only really get the end of the story of when we get to the suttas, if that makes sense. This is evidence to me of a longer tradition or a longer trajectory of meditation practice going on in India before the Buddha. And it has different names, different practices, different stages. And we're sort of seeing these versions as they continue to evolve before we see something that gets settled upon as jhana later in the future. So this is a very fascinating meditation thing here, right? There's a lot of attention given to the Anapanasati Sutta, which is the breathing meditation sutta, or there's a lot of attention given to the Samanapala Sutta, the fruits of the renunciant life sutra, in terms of trying to get a sense of what meditation was in early Buddhism. But I think that there should be some attention given to this in an academic context to see like, okay, we've got jhanic meditation going on, but it's earlier iteration. How many more iterations are there? What does this indicate about meditation going on in Brahmanism concurrent with Buddhism, right? Does that suggest maybe a Brahmanical origin of jhanic meditation? Or does it suggest or at least just a non-Buddhist origin, at least in part, of jhanic meditation? And when and why does jhana meditation take the form that we're used to? That's a very fascinating avenue, I think, that hasn't really been chased down because, unfortunately, these texts, they are frequently lost to time because in India, the paper technology just wasn't as good. And so a lot of those manuscripts have just disintegrated, unfortunately. And it's hard to find the actual primary sources to do that research. But I still think it's worth trying because it shows that one of the most crucial things going on in Buddhism might not be Buddhist.
That's a very interesting idea. And like you, I wish I could dig into that more, but the manuscripts are gone. What are you going to do? So that's a different way of looking at it than what I was thinking. But either way is an interesting way to interpret it. It's either, you need to already know a little bit to understand what's happening here. And because we already know a bit about what's happening here, we can kind of gloss over details. Or it can be a matter of this is what it looked like at the time the details weren't set yet. Seems equally possible and equally interesting.
Yeah, well, and it starts with one, right, in the past, and then it turns into the other, right? So in the past, it's like the details aren't set yet. And then now in the present, it's sort of like you say, this is an intermediate sutra where a modern person can read this and say jhana and then kind of move on and be okay, because they know what that means. And that indicates a clear formula and a clear path to them, so they can just sort of understand like, yeah, there might have been some tiny little differences here or there back in the time period, but what this is to me now is jhana.
So the last detail I wanted to bring up is Bharadvaja. So Bharadvaja is the second follower of Brahmanism in this, and he kind of shuts up after the Buddha starts talking, and it's only the other Brahmin actually addressing the Buddha at this point. I'm not sure there's much to say about that, but it was interesting as I was reading. It really stands out.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if we were to imagine that this is an actual historical encounter between people, I think that just manners dictates that only one person talks to the Buddha at a time, right? Like you don't have three-way conversations. That's kind of just not something that you would do with like a respected thinker like this. And then we can also look at it textually and say, okay, the authors just didn't want to try and juggle a three-way conversation when they were writing this down. Maybe we just feed both Bharadvaja's and Vaseta's questions to Vaseta and then just let it be like that to make it easier for them as well. So there's that aspect. But then I also think that this is an interesting and unanswerable question because Vaseta and Bharadvaja are listed earlier in the sutta as masters of the three Vedas, right? These are like highly respected thinkers. These aren't just like two guys. Like these aren't just two random followers of Brahmanism or acolytes of Brahmanism. These are masters of their texts. They're masters of their interpretation and their knowledge of the texts. And so like, it's fascinating to me that they're having this debate amongst themselves. And then one of them is kind of elected the speaker to like transmit that debate. And the sutta, even though Bharadvaja never says anything, the sutta kind of ends with both of them being converted, which is fascinating. I don't know why he doesn't ever say anything else after the beginning, but his silence is noted for sure.
Anything that you wanted to talk about that I didn't get to?
Yeah, so I would like to wrap up this discussion with as much of a rebuttal from the Brahmanical house as I could possibly give, even though I'm not an expert, right? So that should be the big asterisk going into this for anyone listening, is that I don't know all of the details about all of this. I'm not an expert in Brahmanism, but there are some very broad defenses that can be leveled, I think, and should be leveled, because we don't get to hear back from Brahmins after the sutta ends. They just kind of end and say, the Buddha won, Bharadvaja and Vaseta convert. That's the end. So, in defense of the Brahmins, I would say that in the earlier exchange where the Buddha says, is there even a single Brahmin, who has seen the divinity with their own eyes? And then the pair answer no. The Brahmins don't actually claim to have themselves achieved Brahman, because that means that they would have died, right? So the exchange earlier gives the impression or the suggestion that the Brahmins are lying to people, or they're misleading them somehow, or they're selling them the Brooklyn Bridge somehow. And that's not necessarily how I think it would shake out if you asked an actual Brahmin who wasn't a Buddhist convert what they thought about the issue. They don't feel like they're misrepresenting or like they're misleading or lying. They kind of are more likely to feel like they are just showing you a path and the best way to get to the end of that path. And in a lot of ways, that's no different from what the Buddha does. The next point of defense I'd like to level for the Brahmins is that, as I said earlier, there may be some Brahmins that are hostile to Buddhism or to other outside ways of thinking, but most seem neutral, and most seem to not really care at this point in history if they know, or otherwise they believe the Buddha to be a highly respected thinker. We've talked before about how later in history, some Hindu practitioners and thinkers begin to interpret the Buddha as being an avatar of one of their gods, as being an avatar of Vishnu. And you don't get to be an avatar of Vishnu if you're a hated, heretical figure. You have to be very highly respected, and you have to be thought of as having very interesting and good things to say to be able to be called an avatar of Vishnu. So I think that it's unfair to say that their hearts are full of enmity, where in reality and in history, there were several attempts to pay respect, but also to even bring Buddhism into the fold of this sort of pan-Indian philosophy, so I don't think that it's very nice. And I think that it's kind of hypocritical, like I said earlier, to call these people full of enmity when they're showing up and just asking questions of Buddhism and trying to understand what it's all about. The next point of defense is that Vedic Brahmanism, which is what the Buddha is sort of globally critiquing through this exchange, is not a monolith. And the texts themselves, the Vedas, are just as confusing, just as contradictory, and just as ambiguous as all other religious texts. And so, calling out anyone specific, he does have a list of Vedic thinkers that are supposed masters of the Vedas, or calling out the entire text themselves is just not really a good argument strategy. Calling out specific thinkers and picking out issues in their argumentative structure could be one thing, but calling them out just because they read the Vedas doesn't make any sense. And calling out the Vedas globally doesn't make any sense either, because like a lot of other religious texts, they say just about everything. And what I mean by that is they say everything that is necessary to defend two sides of any and every argument. They say enough to bring you lots of ammunition for sniping anyone who has the opposite opinion that you have. And that's true of most religious texts. That's kind of one of their purposes, is to fuel these sort of debates and arguments at any level of violence or nonviolence that you want to carry, historically speaking, right? It could be a crusade, or it could be a conversation between two guys in the deer park, so to speak. And so I think that it's kind of unfair to just say you can throw out everything in the Vedas, because they don't say anything useful. They don't say anything productive. the Buddha will have knowledge of the Vedas at this point in history, but it's just kind of an unfair diagnosis of the texts, in my opinion.
Makes sense. And again, this is a Buddhist text that is trying to proclaim the superiority of Buddhism. And a way you can do that is by making the thing you are arguing against seem lesser in a way that is inaccurate or misrepresentative. So that is a thing that humans do. And so here it is being done in this sutra. Overall, this is an interesting look into the dynamics of differing ways of thinking. And it's one-sided, but it is a side in a active and involved part of this religion that we've decided to study. So on that note, this is just an interesting thing to read, to see how Buddhists would portray their process of conversion from other traditions. So that part is just an interesting look into this part of the religion.
Absolutely. I agree. And I also, one of the reasons I picked this text as well is because I think that it's interesting to discuss an episode where a conversion is happening. A lot of people don't think that Buddhism is a proselytizing or converting religion. They don't think that there's missions to go and convert the non-believers or the wrong believers or whatnot. But this is an example of a text that shows that actually conversion does exist in Buddhism. And this is a pretty good picture of how it would take place. So consider that in the larger context of how we interpret Buddhism in the West and in the 21st century as being what it is or isn't, right? This is a clear case of conversion, and it sets the precedent for a lot of conversion practices and mission practices that go on throughout Buddhist history. So it's a very interesting precedent for those types of things.
All right. Well, I don't think I have anything more to talk about on the subject, so I think it is time for us to wrap up.
Yes, this has been our discussion of the Tevijja Sutta. We read the entirety of the Bhikku Sujato translation. There's other translations out there, and I encourage you to check them out if you're interested, and I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening.
If you like our show and would like to support us financially, we ask instead that you send that generosity to a worthy cause. For now, we ask that you donate to a local food bank. We encourage international listeners to do this as well, but this especially goes out to our American listeners. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP for short, is currently suspended. SNAP benefits help feed people all across the U.S., particularly people with children or who are disabled, elderly, and/or people of color. This is going to leave many Americans unable to afford food. Right now, food banks are the best equipped to help people affected. Times are hard, and they're only going to get worse before they get better. If we're going to get through this, we have to take care of each other. If you can, we recommend that you donate cash instead of food. These groups buy their supplies at wholesale prices, which are much lower than retail prices that most consumers will pay. They can stretch a dollar a lot farther than most of us. We also suggest that you donate locally, which you can do by searching your zip code on feedingamerica.org's Find Your Local Food Bank section, linked in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.